Rather than pursuing their legal careers as a human rights lawyer, many would prefer to lean on the commercial side to have a more stable income. Why did you decide to become a human rights lawyer? Was there some sort of calling?
That's of course quite a personal question. To be honest, I went into law school with the specific objective of becoming a human rights lawyer. I didn't sort of go into law school and then look around for a career. The question slightly maybe assumes that I had a very specific objective in going into law school. I knew that law was a powerful tool to advance human rights. I've been a human rights activist all my life before I went to law school. I wrote the LSAT in Zimbabwe, where I was a mathematics teacher, as it were. As it happens, my first degree was in mathematics, and at that time, South Africa was still a white-dominated racist state. Apartheid was still in place, and Zimbabwe was on the front line of that. I'd been an activist against apartheid, so the law degree was really a continuation of my my social engagement, if you will, previous to that. So, it had never been my intention to go into law to become a commercial lawyer or to make money. I would say, I mean, you mentioned stability in your question. I don't want to give the wrong impression. You can be perfectly stable. You make an adequate and stable and secure living as a human rights lawyer. Of course, you don't make the same level of income, so you're not as rich as those guys that go into commercial law, for example, or tax law or whatever it may be. But it's solid enough. I would say, I mean, I think perhaps interesting for your listeners, when I went into law school, as a very rough estimate, I would say about a third of the class, of my class, were interested in social causes. So I wasn't by no means the only one. There were quite a few of us. There were 150 students in my intake year, and I would say 40 or 50 of them had this objective of social, objectives with law. But somehow the law school process hammered that out of almost everyone, and the law firms came and interviewed and brought people in or sucked people in, if you will. And so by the end of it, only 2 or 3 of us ended up going into what I would call alternative careers. So that was, for me, was quite interesting to observe that. And I still go back every year or every couple of years and give a talk at my law school at their careers day to try to, open up the minds of students and to give them other options. And there's a huge amount of interest in that. I don't know what the percentages are these days in terms of people pursuing more commercial or traditional law careers and those pursuing alternative careers. I suspect more are doing alternative careers than did in my day, but I don't really know that. But anyway, I mean, for me, I was using law to further a human rights agenda rather than sort of stumbled upon it, as it were.
So, were there any particular hurdles that you faced throughout your years working as a human rights lawyer?
I think the biggest challenge, and this might seem a bit ironic, the biggest challenge is actually to find a career in that, a job basically in that field. Even though we went from sort of 150 or 50 interests in social careers down to only 3 or 4, I think one of the reasons for that was it's very easy to follow a commercial career or a traditional law career. There are a number of quite a few globally interesting human rights careers in law, but it's not. I would say the demand for that is much greater than the number of positions. Just as an example, we hired recently a legal officer who started on the 1st of January. Actually, moved to Halifax from Singapore, and we had well over 100 applicants for that position. So I think it shows that there's significant interest in these careers and not so many of them. Otherwise, of course, as a human rights lawyer, you are often fighting against very entrenched political interests. And when we talk about Hong Kong and China, I think that's a very clear case of that. So you face challenges in achieving the objectives that you're seeking to achieve. You're always fighting against greater powers than yourself, basically. So it's not easy to succeed, although I mean, we do have obviously successes, important successes as well. So that's one challenge, I would say. It's also, I run a nonprofit organization, so we rely on donors for funding. We don't charge our clients. We don't raise money in that way. So fundraising is always a challenge. We always have to spend far more time than I would want to raising money, which is not, it's not our objective to raise money. Our objective is to support human rights, but we still have to do that to be able to pursue our human rights objective. I wish we could spend less time on that and more on our core activities, but otherwise, I mean, I think it is certainly a very, very rewarding career. I would encourage anyone who is thinking about it to look seriously into it. One thing I would say, I mean, I don't make as much money as most of my colleagues who graduated with me, but most of them earn more than I do. But I would say that I have a more exciting life, and I get to do more interesting and certainly more satisfying things than many of them. I mean, not to say that what they're doing is not interesting or satisfying, but my life is very interesting, very satisfying. So it's that's a huge reward that I would say in the long term is more important than money.
The Center for Law and Democracy, which you founded, is an NGO which advocates for human rights and democracy. To what extent do you think the current pandemic has affected the development of human rights and democracy around the globe?
That's an interesting question. And I think, as with many things with the pandemic, as with almost everything with the pandemic, I think it's too early to really say. We're still in the midst of this pandemic. I mean, things may, certain countries have moved further in terms of conquering it, as it were. And we have the vaccine now, and that will, I'm confident, bring this pandemic to an end. But we don't quite know how things are going to look. We don't know how things might bounce back from the pandemic at every level. I mean, the social impact of the pandemic, which we see around us. Anytime you walk out in Durham, you're confronted with that social reality. People are wearing masks, people are avoiding each other, we're not behaving in normal ways. We don't know how people will bounce back from that, and I think the same is true of democracy and human rights. At a very basic level, the pandemic has enabled restrictions on human rights that we have never seen before. For example, I'm nearly 60 years old, and in my lifetime, Canada has, or at least the part of Canada that I live in, has never imposed restrictions on human rights based on an emergency. That has never happened before. And now we have had fairly strict restrictions and very, very intrusive restrictions, most particularly on our freedom of movement, which is also a human right. And we've accepted those by and large. Some people don't, but most people accept them. So, I mean, this is a phenomenon that we have never witnessed in most Western countries, that our rights would actually be formally restricted by government based on an emergency. But I think in terms of freedom of expression, which I think your question is probably more focused on that, I mean, in a country like Canada, we have seen a few little wobbles on that. For example, a lot of jurisdictions in Canada stopped processing freedom of information requests. So requests to access information held by the government, they said, we can't do that, or we're out of the office, or we're too busy, or whatever it was. They made excuses about that. I don't think that was proper. I don't think that was justified. In almost every case, of course, if it was a physical record in the office and you weren't going into the office, you couldn't go and get it and give it to the requester. But almost all of our governmental functions are now electronic. Almost all of them are. And so I think that almost all of the time, and some departments were truly slammed by the emergency, the Department of Finance, obviously the Department of Health, Education, people that had to really, but many other departments actually slowed down because not much was going on. So there's absolutely no reason for them to stop processing requests. So we had some small wobbles, but we didn't see any frontal attack, I would say, on freedom of expression. But we have certainly in a lot of other countries, especially countries that are less democratic and where governments are seeking opportunities to take advantage of whatever may come their way to control speech, to control democracy, to cement themselves in power. So we did see a lot of governments pass restrictive legislation, take advantage of this. And I think there'll be a question later on about disinformation, misinformation. So they took advantage of that. Obviously, dis and misinformation during a pandemic can seem much more dangerous, and potentially it was more dangerous. So we saw governments passing laws on that, which was not legitimate, and other governments passing laws, for example, saying that no one could mention information about the pandemic, about statistics and about the rate of penetration of the pandemic and that sort of thing, unless it came from an official source, which obviously is completely illegitimate and actually illustrates the real importance of freedom of expression. Obviously, official sources are supposed to provide us with good information about important social developments, of which the pandemic is perhaps the most important that we've ever witnessed for a long time. But that doesn't mean that they can be a sole voice on that, and they can make mistakes, they can have flaws in their collection methodologies, and they can even distort information where they want to de-emphasize, for example, the rate of infections because that looks politically bad for them. So for all of that, we need the media and others to be able to produce their own statistics, to produce their own claims, and of course, officials can contest that and say, these are the statistics, we believe these are right, and the public decide who they trust, basically. So we did see a number of incidents of attacks on freedom of expression, very specific, very targeted, in some cases clumsy, in other cases, I would say, and just sort of over the top, or out of concern or fear, as was the case, I think, in Canada. I mean, they didn't, the freedom of information freezes were not intended to promote secretive government or to hide government or that sort of thing. They were just, people didn't know what was going on and they overreacted. That's my interpretation of that. I think another very serious feature that has accompanied this, and we've seen this even in democratic countries, even in the most democratic countries, and I'm not saying that Canada is the most democratic country, but it's a pretty democratic country, we saw it here a lot, is governments closing down the democratic process. So they closed government. They said, well, we can't carry on. They closed parliaments, not government, but parliaments and legislatures and even committees. They said, the distancing rules and the spread of the disease means that we can't continue these functions. And I think in the very early days of the pandemic, where nobody really knew what was going on and everybody was trying to be as, well, not everybody, but I mean, sensible countries were trying to be as precautionary as possible. There was perhaps some justification for that, but we have seen in many countries the continuation of that. Just as an example, my own province in Canada, Nova Scotia, has still not opened a legislature, even though we have one of the lowest rates of transmission in the country. I think we have a population of 1 million people and 19 active cases as of today, so basically nothing. We had 4 new cases yesterday. I mean, all of them related to international travel or travel from outside of the jurisdiction. So we know, we've got it under control, and yet still the legislature is not open. So I think that there has been a very serious attempt by governments, and this is at a time when governments are making unprecedentedly important decisions, not only in terms of restricting rights, as I mentioned before, but also in terms of health measures. What are they doing? What are they doing to counter the pandemic? How are they rolling out vaccines? What decisions are being made? All of that. There's big debates about what's the best strategy with vaccinations, which are going to roll out relatively slowly, at least over 6 months, let's say, or probably longer than that. Who should be first in line? These are things that need to be publicly debated, and we need legislatures to be hammering away at that, and for this issue to be sort of, forged in the harsh light of legislative debate. So I think that we've seen some serious impacts in that degree, in that area. I presume that all of that will disappear, at least in most countries, but I think we will certainly find a number of countries where more serious and permanent damage has been done to democratic processes because of these because of the rollbacks during the pandemic. Perhaps they won't go back to where they were before. So I think there's sort of a package of measures that together are potentially quite threatening, but it's still too early really to say how that's going to play out.
Prior to your founding of the Center for Law and Democracy, you were a member of Article 19, another NGO with a similar agenda. What drove you to start the Center for Law and Democracy? Did you feel like you could achieve more in the act of pursuing fundamental rights or democracy by creating it?
I guess I would have two answers to that. And the first, to be very open and frank with you, the Article 19, as you probably know, is based in London. So we lived in London at that time. And my wife and I are both from Canada, though. And we had decided when we moved to England, sort of, well, in 1994, as it was, that we would return to Canada when our first child came of school-going age. So that was a very personal decision that we made for very personal reasons, which I don't need to go into. And that is exactly what we did. So we left London in 2002, just as our first child reached the age of 5, which is when you start school. I remained with Article 19 for another 7 years. So I stayed with 7.5 years. So I stayed with Article 19 until the end of 2009, working from Canada. I traveled a lot with my work, so I was going through London all the time. So I had good contact with the office. I was the director, actually, of the law and the Asia programs at the time. So I was running a big chunk of the operation in Article 19, and I needed to connect with my staff and things. And I did that, both through electronic tools, but also by visiting and things. But over time, it became, I would say, a little bit more difficult, and also the sort of the logic of being here and connected to an organization over there became more strained. And also, I guess, as I became more experienced and senior. I mean, I was the director of, as I mentioned, the law and the Asia program, so I was already a senior person, but there wasn't anywhere, being out of the office, I couldn't go anywhere up from there. So eventually I decided that it was time to found my own organization, basically. So that's a personal story behind it. But the mandate of Article 19 is a very unique one. It focuses only on freedom of expression and has a very focused law and policy mandate. And it's a great organization, and I had a great time working there. But I also felt, even while I was there, but certainly as part of my motivation to start a new organization, that there was a need for more organizations working in that area, for a wider range of perspectives on the issue, for some competition. Competition among NGOs is I wouldn't say the same as competition between commercial entities, but it is, I think, equally important in other ways. We need to compete to keep each other sharp and to keep hungry and lean and mean and moving forward and things. And so I think for those reasons, it was good to have more organizations in the space. I'm not saying that there were no other organizations doing that kind of work, but I think no organizations really competing that directly with Article 19. So I think it's good, has been good for both of us, actually, to have that kind of competition.
So it's obvious that more conflicts between individuals and authorities are happening around the globe, like the Black Lives Matter protests in the USA, the Thai protest, and the protests in Hong Kong. Like, there's so many things happening in the world now. And some blame that like social media are being used, like Twitter, Instagram, are being used to spread hatred and false information. Do you think this kind of thoughts or like this kind of thinking is attacking press freedom or like freedom of speech?
I think you started out your question saying it's obvious that there are more conflicts, and I'm not sure that proposition is correct. There do seem to be a lot going on right now, and it is an active time, but I think that there have been other times when we've seen this level of activism. I mean, think about the protests that brought down communism in East and Central Europe. that was a huge region of the world, and you know, not too far off of that time, a lot of one-party states in Africa democratized, and there was a wave of democratization also in Latin America, all of which basically certainly pre-social media, and before Facebook was born, for example, but pre even strong digital environment. And I think, and for me, I see the social media facilitation, if you will, of these kinds of movements, and the three that you mentioned, you know, the Black Lives Matter, the Thai protests, and the Hong Kong protests. For me, those are all, you know, great movements, movements which are addressing social wrongs. They are, you know, things that we need in the world. You know, we need to address inequality. We need to fight for democracy, you know, wherever that need exists. And well, we need to fight for democracy everywhere. Let me correct that, because I think even in Canada, we need to continue fighting for democracy. If we didn't do that, you know, we've enjoyed a long, deep history of democracy, but if we didn't continue to fight for it, we would lose it. And I think, you know, the events of the last few days in our neighbor to the south have demonstrated that pretty clearly, that nobody should take democracy too much for granted. I don't think any of us would have imagined an invasion of the Capitol in the US by thugs, basically, in the way that we've seen in the last few days. But where there are particular injustices and where protest is the only way to really combat those injustices, or where you need to engage in protest to maintain rights and equality and democracy, to me, it's great that those things are happening. That's what we need. We need more of that around the world. And it's great that social media and the traditional media as well, and whatever else can support that. I think, though, that what we're seeing in parallel to that is a massive growth in, for lack of a better term, nasty speech online. People can speak anonymously. They can, you know, get together in little bubbles of hate, if you will, or of bias or misinformation, and, you know, circulate and foment those negative values within their little groups. And social media has very much supported that, indeed even encouraged it, because it sort of feeds back to you the kind of speech that you want to hear, rather than a more diverse diet of speech which you get on the traditional media. So if you watch a legacy media, the BBC in the UK, you're going to hear both things that you like to hear and things that you don't like to hear. You're going to hear the news, or, you know, the news as selected by the BBC, a cross section of it. Whereas in your social media space, you can just feed on the things that you want to hear only, and not hear anything else. And I think that that's a very serious problem. So on the one hand, I would see social media as having really supported and helped the organization of democracy and human rights movements, the three that you mentioned being examples of that. And of course, I mean, not everything that happens within those movements is perfect. You know, the Black Lives Matter protests were largely peaceful, but not 100% so. And of course, there's been a lot of claims that the protests in Hong Kong, which I think were almost entirely peaceful, but there've been allegations that they weren't, and things. So, and I'm sure there might have been individuals who, you know, stepped a little out of line, or otherwise, you know, infiltrators who did that. There's a lot of confusion about these things, but on the other hand, there certainly has been a lot of negative impacts from the, basically, I mean, if we're going to be honest about it, from the facilitation of free speech that the social media have provided. It's because everybody can say whatever they want, positive or negative, that all of this negative speech, the hate speech and the misinformation and whatever, the malinformation and the harassment and attacks on people, all of that stuff is also an exercise of free speech, facilitated by social media, but is leading to some very negative social consequences. So I think there's this sort of yin and yang, if you will, about the social media. On the one hand, they have really facilitated human rights actors, but they have also facilitated everybody else with positive and negative impacts.
When we measure the pros and cons, like for example, what Donald Trump did in the Congress, like the Twitter, do you still think that social media is helping us to promote this kind of democracy rather than destroying it? Because like if there's people, they are not respecting democracy, but they're using social media to attain certain objectives, then they may just destroy our freedom.
This is the battle of our era and the challenge of our era. I mean, there's I think a question later on about mis and disinformation, and I won't get into the details about that. But I mean, how to when social media first exploded onto the scene, and not just social media, I mean, when digital communications, which preceded social media, email, whatever. I think most of us just saw the positive side. We could communicate with activists in other countries. We could do that anonymously. We could facilitate their pro-democracy work, their human rights work. We could, people could stand up anywhere and speak to the world and protest bad things that were happening here and there. And I mean, most of us just sort of saw that as a massive facilitation of voice to the benefit of everybody. And in the last, I guess, 10 years or so, and accelerating over that period, we have seen a lot of negative impacts. We've seen foreign governments interfere with malign motivations in elections, in democracies, and even in non-democracies. We have seen governments conduct massive surveillance using these new tools, illegitimate surveillance from a human rights perspective. So we've seen, facilitation of some negative things. And I think that we don't yet have, and I'll say more about this when we get to the mis and disinformation question, but I don't think we yet understand how to strike an appropriate balance between protecting the free speech elements of these tools and yet controlling the negative effects or mitigating the negative effects. And I think that that is an enormous challenge. I think that, we have some standards that we can state, but we don't have really the proper tools for that. I was at a conference, a media freedom conference in October, I'm going to say. October, November, time flies around in a different way when you're on COVID time. And the new UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, Irene Khan, said, and it was really refreshing to hear her say that, because I don't think anybody, I mean, I've said it, but I haven't heard very many people say it as clearly as that. She said, neither governments, nor companies, nor human rights activists know how to deal with this problem. And I think that's absolutely correct. And I think we need to do some really innovative, out-of-the-box thinking. The traditional, many traditional free speech lawyers and activists kind of, in my view, take a very strict, somewhat blinkered view about this. We cannot just go back to the old principles and say, well, governments can't do this and can't do that and whatever. I mean, those are important values, but we are in a new environment now. We are seeing harms, even to the point where these tools can undermine the very cornerstone of our democracies, which is elections. They can confuse people, they can misinform people, even to the point where people don't know where to go to vote. This has happened, but certainly as to what the election's about, what things stand for, then there are some very interesting studies. I mean, we probably don't have time to get into them, but of how people got confused and voted based on completely misconstrued information or wrong information, and voted a way that they wouldn't have voted if they hadn't been fed that information. So this is a serious undermining of our very democracy. So we do need to address that. It's not, we can't just take traditional viewpoints on that. But where the solution lies, not so easy to say.
You mentioned like we're in a new century, like there's some different ways to promote freedom. Like my question is, how can we, the normal people, or like those being affected, to secure freedom of speech when the government is trying to lock it, or like the government is trying to make some kind of censorship? Like, how can we protect this freedom?
That depends very much on the overall context in which you exist. So, I mean, I think, as I said before, every country needs to fight to defend its democracy and its free speech. And we see periodically, even in very established democracies, governments trying to pass bad laws, laws that control speech. Governments always, I mean, it's just inherent in the nature of government. They always want to have more control. They don't want to be subject to criticism. They always have an uneasy relationship with free, independent, and critical media, which is holding fire to their feet. So, I mean, there's always that tension, but we have democratic modalities for doing that. We expose the issue, we have experts talk about it, we convince the general public that this thing is not right, and then usually the government will back off, or sometimes they will pay at the ballot box in the next election, and then the thing will be reversed at that point. So that we have, in established democracies, as you move down the spectrum to more repressive environments, it becomes increasingly difficult to know what to do, to be honest. I mean, I think that, I mean, since you're the Hong Kong Journalists Association, I think we have to note the special situation of China. China, and I don't know if you have been following it, but Canada has been having some difficulties, I would say, in its relation. Well, not say Canada's been having some difficulties in its relationship with China. We have senior Huawei executive not on trial here, actually. She's being an extradition request in her is being determined in relation to her, and China has retaliated by arresting and imprisoning 2 Canadians for 2 years, and there's been a lot of other tensions in the relationship. And I mean, the problems are with the special problems with China are, I mean, first of all, China is a vast and incredibly powerful country. So it's not, I mean, we can push around Sri Lanka to some extent, or we can push back on Sri Lanka at least, but not so easy to do that with China. And as part of that is that our economies are very, at least in the case of Canada, but for a large number of countries, are Western countries, the democracies that might support voices of democracy in less democratic countries, our economies are interlinked, and pushing back against China costs us money. It's as simple as that. And China has proven itself very, very willing to use its economic power to achieve its political ends. So, and we've seen that. And I mean, and I'm not talking about the battle between the US and China, which was more or less started by the US, and whatever the merits of that. I'm talking about sort of China punching back when countries criticize it. So it's much more difficult to mobilize in those kinds of situations. Almost every other country has a higher degree of sensitivity, I would say, to international public opinion and to international diplomacy. So I think that, mobilizing Western governments and informing Western governments and convincing them about the importance of a situation is a very important tool. Mobilizing local populations, again, depending on the degree of repression in the country, very difficult to do that in mainland. Almost impossible to do that in mainland China, and increasingly difficult to do that even in Hong Kong, as we have seen again in the events of the last few days. So I think that depending on your circumstances, there are a whole range of tools that can be used, of which awareness raising and mobilization, protest if necessary, a peaceful protest obviously can be used. But as you march up the level of repression and power, basically those tools become less and less available.
So like what you mentioned, government don't really like press, they don't really like media, because they are just destroying their plans. They're just like making their plans in different ways. And do you think like in developed countries, certain level of censorship is important? So I don't mean like extreme censorship. Like, I don't mean censorship like China, to be obvious, but I mean like certain levels. So like to limit the amount of hate speech, things like that. Do you think it is important to restrict certain kinds of freedom to promote freedom?
I'm going to bracket out the word censorship because I like to be a bit of a purist. I'm a lawyer, of course, and I like to be a bit of a purist in the way I use terms. And I like to restrict the word censorship to the prior control of speech before it goes out. So, for example, I started working in Myanmar in 2012, and at that time they had a regime of censorship for the written press. You would take your copy, you would submit it to the censor, who has a sign on his office, the censor, chief censor of Burma, and that was still the sign on the office. And I have a picture of myself standing underneath that sign. It's quite an interesting picture. And his office would, black out things that they said you couldn't say, and then they would return the copy to you, and you would publish it absent those things, or you would risk, of course, being prosecuted. And censorship for me has a very negative connotation. What I think, not what I think, under international law, it's accepted that free speech is not an absolute right. You have an absolute right to life. You have an absolute right not to be tortured. Certain rights are absolute and certain rights are not absolute. So they may be subjected to restrictions or limitations, and freedom of expression is certainly one of those. And under international law, the test for restrictions is that the restriction, there's a three-part test essentially. The restriction must be provided by law. So it's not a minister or a police officer or an individual that can restrict your free speech. It's only the parliament that passes a law. Then underneath that law, people act to apply the law that can restrict your speech. That's the first thing. Second is that any restriction must serve certain limited aims, and those are the rights and reputations of others, national security, public order, public health, or public morals. So that's it. Now, rights and reputations of others is quite a wide category. So we have a lot of rights. So to protect those rights, and you mentioned hate speech, so equality is a right, and hate speech laws serve to promote equality, or good hate speech laws do that. But if a restriction serves another aim, then it's not legitimate. And I'll give you as an example. In Australia, you're required to vote. So it's not optional to vote. If they have an election, you're legally required. You must go out and vote. So someone was prosecuted for urging citizens, for inciting citizens not to vote. So inciting citizens to break the law. Said, don't vote. I'm saying this is an unjust regime, and he was convicted for that under Australian law because that's an incitement to a crime. And that case went to the UN Human Rights Committee, and the UN Human Rights Committee said, well, hang on a second, looking at these aims, national security, public order, public health, and public morals, none of those are about voting. So it's not legitimate to restrict free speech to maintain this rule about voting. Yes, you can have the rule about voting, you can prosecute those people that don't vote, but you can't prosecute people who incite others not to vote, because that is not a legitimate aim under international law. So the restriction must serve one of those aims, and then it must be necessary to protect that aim or the interest. And that's a very complicated legal test, which involves a number of elements. There must be a very close relationship. It must, the benefit of the restriction must be greater than the harm to freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. Then there's, international courts get into great detail on that issue. We see, a number of restrictions on free speech in all or practically all of democracies. You mentioned hate speech. Actually, international law requires states to prohibit hate speech, but they define that very narrowly as advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to violence, discrimination, or hostility. So it's really a tight test, and the law should be phrased narrowly. Banning merely racist speech, even though racist speech is nasty, but we allow that because it's, if we ban it, then we'll chill out a bunch of speech and whatever. It's only the really hateful stuff that we're going to ban. Defamation is another area. Everyone bans defamation. Everyone has some constraints to protect national security. That is also one of the areas where there's a lot of abuse of restrictions. We need rules on public order. You can't incite other people to, throw rocks at police or whatever. So we need these kinds of restrictions to maintain basic values in our society, and incitement of violence against other people, and so on and so forth. So I think there's always a very delicate balancing act, and it's not easy to maintain that balance, and it's a constant debate and struggle, even even where there are not political motivations for restrictions on speech. We've been talking a lot about how governments don't like when they want to restrict, but there are other examples. For example, again, an example from my province, which is a small province of 1 million people. We had a case where a woman was a young girl, actually a 17-year-old, was bombarded with basically bullying type messages and compromising images, and she committed suicide. So people were very, very upset about that. It's a small, close-knit society. We don't like to see things like that happen in our society. And the government passed an anti-bullying law. It didn't do so to control speech, or it did do to control speech, but not for political reasons. It didn't try, it wasn't to enhance the government's political power. It saw a social problem and it saw a solution. That law was ridiculous. It was way too general. It was too broad, and people could then, it was never used. In fact, it was never used in a proper bullying case, but instead it was used by different people to push back on criticism that they didn't like and that kind of thing, which they could characterize as bullying because it hadn't been written properly, hadn't been written tightly, didn't meet the test for restrictions either under the Canadian Constitution or under international law. And in the first case that was brought against it, it was struck down by our courts as an unreasonable restriction on free speech. So, I think that, it's always difficult to navigate the appropriate balance in these cases. And we see, some flagrant abuses by countries, and we see some more subtle cases like that. That wasn't really a subtle case, but more, let's say, goodwill cases, but just, where governments act foolishly. So I think that, this is a constant struggle to maintain that balance.
What effects do you think the national security law has on the media in Hong Kong? Take, for example, the arrest of Apple Daily's founder, Jimmy Lai Qiying, on charges of fraud and coalition with foreign forces. Do you think the media in Hong Kong still remains independent and trustworthy, or will such political actions assault Hong Kong's press freedom?
It's very clear that the national security law, and especially but other moves that have been taken over the last, since the protests against the extradition law started in Hong Kong, that there have been a number of moves that have been direct frontal attacks on press freedom in Hong Kong. And I think that anybody that denies that is not recognizing what press freedom is. And I think that my own organization issued a public statement on the Jimmy Lai case, I think in August of this year, I guess, and we protested his arrest very strongly and said it was a gross abuse of freedom of expression. I think if to analyze the national security law, I think that there are two main aspects of it which are problematical. From a Hong Kong perspective, and from a global free speech perspective, I guess. From a global free speech perspective, it includes a number of very vague and general restrictions on free speech, what people sometimes call rubber rules. Rubber in the sense that they stretch and can move around as you pull them one way or another. And those kinds of restrictions, which we see all around the world, are expressly prohibited by international law. So I said that the restrictions, the first condition is that restrictions must be provided by law. It doesn't just mean that there's a law, there are also conditions on the quality of that law. And one of the conditions on the quality of the law is the law must be clear and precise. Otherwise, the law doesn't really define what is prohibited. If you're going to prohibit speech, you need to tell people clearly what they're not allowed to say. It's only in that circumstance that a law restricting speech can be legitimate. So rubber rules by definition, and indeed by design, not just by definition, they're designed not to meet that standard. They're designed to be able to be applied in circumstances when the government wants it, rather than because the speech falls outside of the scope of protected speech. Subversion, for example, is prohibited by that law, or collusion with foreign actors. What is collusion with foreign actors? I mean, you would need something much more specific. doing business for somebody else. A lot of people in Hong Kong do business with other people. Is that collusion with a foreign actor? And I think it's the heart and beating soul of the Hong Kong economy is collusion, if you will, with foreign actors. Subversion and other terms. And one of the charges against Jimmy Lai was indeed collusion with foreign agencies. So these rules are offensive to international guarantees of freedom of expression, but they're also incredibly problematical from a press freedom point of view, because basically anything you write that the government doesn't like could be deemed to fall within these provisions, and of course depending on courts and how independent the courts are and that sort of thing. And that leads me to the second set of problems with the national security law, which was, and this is a particular feature of the sort of Hong Kong mainland China relationship. Obviously, it has been led by mainland China, and it substantially increases mainland China's control over free speech in Hong Kong. The very genesis of the law, the fact that it was passed without any consultation with the people of Hong Kong, I mean, that was significantly protested in Hong Kong. I think it's a fundamental breach of any democratic value. You can't impose a law on people, at least any law which affects human rights, without having proper consultations around that. These laws are supposed to go through a rigorous and detailed and lengthy process of debate and consultation in society, so as to avoid that they breach what people want. And people can, if in a normal circumstance, people could then vote against that law later on. That option obviously is not open to Hong Kong, not effectively. But also the powers that they give of direct application of the law, so people can be tried in mainland China courts. Mainland China retains ultimate interpretive control over the law. So I think it really significantly enhances the hand of China in terms of what it would deem to be sensitive speech cases in Hong Kong. So that's really and that's I wouldn't say the first time we've seen anything like that, but this is a significant advancement of mainland Chinese power in that space. And there are a number of other problems with the law. It undermines judicial independence in the sense that the chief executive can appoint judges for that law, and there are a number of other due process concerns about the law. So I think it is, well, not just I think, I mean, all independent commentators have recognized the very, very serious nature of that law as an attack on press freedom and freedom of expression more generally in Hong Kong. And the events of the last few days, and I think 53 people having been arrested, show again the vulnerability, if you will, of Hong Kong and freedom in Hong Kong to that law.
During the political protests in Hong Kong, reports surfaced that Chinese propaganda operations had run disinformation campaigns about the protests on social media, such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. What effects do you think such campaigns affect the independent media's role in Hong Kong?
So I talked before about the kind of the yin and yang, if you will, of social media and the ability of malign actors, if you will, to weaponize it against freedoms. I mean, Facebook, for example, has now recognized that there was this program of disinformation and has taken some steps to address it. It's very, very difficult. Well, I think it's difficult for Facebook to control those things, but also I think Facebook has not done what it should have done given its enormous resources to address those issues. I think if you look at the impact of social media on press freedom, I would say that there are a few impacts. Firstly, there's a massive financial impact. So an enormous amount of advertising has basically left what we might call legacy media and gone to social media. So it's the revenues available to legacy media have plummeted. also as audiences have left, so fewer and fewer people are buying newspapers in almost every country. There's a few countries where newspaper readership is still increasing, but the vast majority of countries that's going down because people don't bother reading a newspaper when they think they're getting the news online. And actually, there are effective ways to get proper news online because, of course, all of these newspapers and media are online as well. I get the Globe and Mail, Canada's leading newspaper, and I get the New York Times all online, not through social media, but directly from them, but still. So there's been a massive drop in revenues, but also I think there's been a fleeing of the audience. And so a lot of people around the world, and for me, the term social media is a really unfortunate term because it's not media at all. In the sense that I understand that word. It's just people, the places where people can chat and whatever. Of course, the media are there, businesses are there, everybody's there. But that doesn't, the fact that media are there along with everyone else, sort of, half of the world is there, or whatever the numbers are right now in terms of Facebook, that doesn't make it media. It's a place where we chit chat and we disseminate whatever we want. That's not a media. Media is a place where, information is investigated, is curated, is presented, is selected, so it's not social media. But then one of the results of this term is that there are a lot of people around the world that believe that it actually is media and that they actually are getting news off of it. I mean, and as I said, there are ways you can get news off of it, but most of what's on social media isn't news. It's just, people chatting. I'm saying something that doesn't, I'm not a media outlet, but what I'm saying to you now, I mean, I happen to be a very serious researcher, and I hope that the things that I'm saying have some, validity and experience and research behind them. But anybody can chat on Facebook and Twitter and whatever, and it doesn't mean that there's any credibility or quality to it at all. And people have lost a sense of what news actually is. And I think that they're in little group and people say things and whatever, and that is even refracted back to the legacy media. So you see on legacy media far more now than you would have 10 years ago. They're printing just opinions of people. I mean, I'm not really interested in what the victim of a criminal offense thinks, because I mean, we pretty much know what they're going to think. Their house was broken into and they think it's outrageous, and they want the hands of the person chopped off. That's not interesting to me, and I don't consider that to be news. But you're seeing more and more and more of that, even in the legacy media, because people get so used to hearing that. That's what they're hearing on Facebook and whatever. So, I mean, I call it Facebook journalism. So I think that we've seen sort of complex interactions between these phenomena, a decline in the quality of even our legacy media, but also a replacement of legacy media by chit chat, if you will, at its lowest level on social media, as well as proper news feeds and things like that. I mean, I'm not saying that that's all that's on Facebook, but that's a lot of it. So I think there's been and that all of that, sort of as a preamble to, that means that when actors wishing to confuse people go online and spread misinformation or disinformation, actually, and then it gets whitewashed through misinformation because people spread it and it goes in all, you launch something out there and then people pick it up and recirculate. It's a bit like laundering illegal funds, right? You make a false statement and then it goes through a few phases, and then suddenly Toby Mendel is retweeting a tweet that's utterly false, and I'm a reliable guy. I mean, I don't do that, but a lot of people do that, so it facilitates that. So I think it has been a very serious attack on, not attack, but it's very seriously undermined the whole social media phenomenon, seriously undermined the legacy media, and we do have these attacks starting with disinformation, including from state actors. And I think that we also need, especially in response to the financial crisis for the legacy media, we need to be recognizing that the media is a public good. We need news, just like we need roads and we need healthcare and we need education, and we pay for those other things. We don't expect the market to deliver us education, well, at least in In Canada, we don't. In Hong Kong, you don't. In Britain, you don't. We don't expect the market to deliver us with healthcare or roads, basically. I mean, of course, there may be some toll roads. But and I think that we need to move to a point where we're seeing the media and news especially, I mean, in the media as vehicles for producing and disseminating it. I think we need to, producing it especially, we need to be seeing that more as a public good and investing far more public money in it.
Secretary for Home Affairs Casper Choi told the Legislative Council last month that Hong Kong is still examine loopholes in our law rules against the spread of misinformation and may refer to overseas legislation such as in Germany, France, and Singapore. Do you think using places such as Singapore as an example in anti-misinformation legislation is appropriate, and fundamentally, if such legislations are necessary?
Singapore does have some good legislation, but not in the area of free speech. And I think it's done a very, very effective job of presenting itself to external actors as a democracy when in fact it's not. So I think it's certainly, I would advise against looking to Singapore, but I think it's reasonable to look to Germany and France, even though I'm quite critical of some of the legislation that's been adopted by those countries. And I think it goes back to the point I made earlier, that it's really, we really don't know how to address the harmful impact of some of the content that's circulating, or a reasonable amount of the content that's circulating on social media, and yet protect free speech. So how to achieve a balance between these two fundamental interests of society. And we really, as I said then, I think we need some out of the box thinking. We need to come up, I mean, my analogy for this is, during the Industrial Revolution, the economic modalities of production were turned upside down or completely reinvented, and we essentially invented a new field of law, tort law, to deal with that, to deal with the harm that these new phenomena were producing. Before that, you had individual artisans and craftsmen who would produce things and whatever, and they just didn't cause major harm in the way that these big companies with their massive productions did. So we responded by developing and changing the legal system, and now we're seeing, and I mean, one of the challenges of these new phenomena, digital communications, are that they are developing so quickly. So law is very slow to develop, and I said before, when we engage in lawmaking that affects freedom of expression, we need to go through robust public consultations, and we do need all of those things. But that means that it moves very slowly, and the legislative process moves slowly, and then the courts move slowly, and everything moves slowly. Whereas that digital technology moves incredibly rapidly. Maybe we need a new concept of law that can, square that circle, as it were, that can allow law to be able to react much more fluidly and effectively, and yet still have the characteristics of the law. And I don't know what that might look like, but I'm when I say out of the box thinking, I mean like that. Perhaps a whole new field of law to deal with this new environment. So I think that we see both democracies and non-democracies experimenting this area. I don't think we've seen anything. Well, we haven't seen anything that I find satisfactory in terms of balancing free speech. The NetzDG law in Germany, for example, I thought it was an interesting approach. I studied it carefully. I think ultimately it doesn't work in terms of achieving that balance. But I firmly believe that we do need something. It's always been recognized that free speech needs to be balanced against other social interests. If we end up protecting free speech to the extent that our democracies are failing, we will not have succeeded in our human rights project, as it were. So we need to do something. I just don't quite know exactly what, and I don't think anybody does yet.